The outbreak of COVID-19 has unfortunately forced countless people to stay locked inside their houses and apartments for the past couple weeks. If you're anything like me, you've probably been playing an absurd amount of video games, refreshing social media, and binging your favorite streaming service like you're on the last week of a free trial. It's fair to say that the lockdown has forced us to adjust to a new way of life, one that would have been far less enjoyable and nearly impossible to sustain in a time before the internet existed. People now, more than ever, are working and streaming and gaming from home. There's no arguing that the internet has been one of the greatest tools to us during this pandemic. But I'd like you to think back to 2017 for a moment, to a time where that tool was at risk of being throttled, overpriced, and manipulated by internet service providers. I'm of course referring to net neutrality. It's an easy issue to forget about given the present circumstances, but the pandemic actually gives us a great opportunity to revisit the issue of net neutrality and maybe even learn something about economics in the process. Now you might be wondering, what does economics have to do with the issue of net neutrality? To answer that question, I interviewed Sean Malone of the Foundation for Economic Education.
I'm Sean Malone, the creative director for the Foundation for Economic Education. My primary roles are kind of extensive actually, but the thing that probably most people would be familiar with is our video content. YouTube, Facebook, all of our social stuff, anything that has to do with audio, video, any kind of imagery, and pretty much the creative direction for everything that we do as an organization.
Sean, in kind of like the layman's terms, how would you really define net neutrality? Can you give maybe a little bit of a brief overview about the logistics of the debate?
The way that I understand it is that net neutrality is a debate between people who fundamentally want to see the internet left free of regulatory control that restricts pricing, primarily over bandwidth and speed of internet service, and people who would set limits on that. For example, by restricting Comcast from charging higher prices for higher bandwidth, or for setting out different pricing relationships between different entities.
Back in 2017, the amount of information that was being spread about net neutrality repeals was pretty overwhelming. I asked Sean to weigh in on the claims surrounding the deregulation of internet service providers. So Sean, 2 or 3 years ago, at the height of the controversy surrounding net neutrality, what were the kinds of different claims that were coming out about the repeals of net neutrality?
Yeah, I remember an awful lot of claims around that time. You know, they varied from big companies colluding to shut other companies out of the internet, massive decline in new competition for video, particularly in the online video and digital media space. People said that we were just going to see monopolies form and nobody was ever going to be able to compete in that arena. I heard innumerable claims of just massive increases in prices to consumers. People would say, 4 or 5 times what you're paying now is what you're going to be paying for internet service next year. One of the big arguments that I've heard over the years from pro-net neutrality policy people has been that, companies like Netflix, for example, might work out a deal with Comcast where they get all the bandwidth or they get preferential treatment, and then upstart competitors to Netflix wouldn't have been able to get their services, into the public, basically, into the market, because they would have been pushed out by these bigger players.
Looking back on some of these claims certainly helps us understand this debate a little bit better, but is more regulation really an effective way to combat price increases and tech monopolies? Understanding the price system will prove that in the years following the net neutrality repeals, it was ultimately deregulation that allowed us to afford and enjoy the open web as we know it today. We don't often think about economics as having a lot to do with something like internet provision. What role does economics play in this whole topic?
In reality, economics is human interaction. It's you and me engaging in some kind of commercial activity, and that it's cooperative, it's competitive, it's all those things. But At the end of the day, it's your choices and my choices, and honestly, millions and millions and millions of other people making decisions about what to produce, what to consume, what to spend their time doing. The thing that we've learned from really a couple hundred years of studying economies is that there are a nearly infinite number of ways that resources could be used. Fundamentally, this is what economics and studying economics is really for. It's to look at the ways in which we take scarcity in the world and make the best of that situation. We take resources that we could use in innumerable ways, and we figure out which ways are most valuable to ideally the greatest number of people. There's a lot of ways to do that, right? You could have some central authority, some dictator come down and say, hey, I'm going to decide that all of the copper in the world is going to go into internet lines, right? You could have a dictator that says that. The problem is the dictator has no way of knowing what resources are available, what people want and need, what's most needed where, at which time. There's a massive knowledge problem that central planning has that is solved by allowing individuals to make their own choices and then observing what are called price signals.
The short explanation for why economics matters in the scope of the net neutrality debate comes down to an understanding of the role of the price system. When a central authority changes or controls the price of a particular commodity, whether it's internet service or milk at the grocery store, it always ends up hurting competition, discouraging capital investment, and ultimately hindering progress.
Most people are sort of vaguely familiar with supply and demand. What I think a lot of times they don't think about is how much those prices affect human behavior. So price signals are what some economists have called incentives wrapped in knowledge. But the idea of knowledge wrapped in an incentive is really, really powerful for the way that we decide how we're using resources. You have high price for internet service, for example, right? Take high price for internet in Ghana could very well not only signal that there's not enough internet service or there are not enough service providers in that area to meet the needs of all the people who are in that area, but it also sends a signal to potential suppliers of internet service, companies that would invest in the capital in Ghana to get in there because the prices are high, they're going to make more money, so there's actually an incentive to get in there. That framework brings us back to net neutrality. If you stop the free movement of prices, what you're stopping is the information and the incentives that are created by those prices. That's the thing I think a lot of net neutrality proponents kind of miss, right? They might be thinking that they're doing something that makes things a little bit more equitable or a little bit more fair for people in the short term, but they're preventing smart, good capital allocation in the long term. And that's a big problem.
Henry Hazlitt famously wrote in his book titled Economics in One Lesson that the art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. Today, even under national pandemic, countless people are using the internet to work and enjoy its services at faster speeds than even before the repeals. At times, it can be easy to point to regulation as the only way to solve our problems of our fears surrounding market failure. But it is also imperative to consider the true effects of government policy and the very real threat of being caught in its crosshairs as consumers, investors, and entrepreneurs.
The bandwidth that we all use on the internet is, like anything else, it's scarce. And it's something that can be allocated in any number of ways. And when you have anything that is scarce, what you need to obtain the knowledge and the correct incentives to allocate it in its most efficient way possible is prices. Net neutrality would prevent the free movement of prices up or down, and as a result would create shortages and supply problems throughout the entire internet system. So we're lucky to have had an internet that was free of net neutrality for the vast majority of its existence. The lack of regulation around price and around the way that you use the internet is probably largely responsible for the internet in its amazing form that we have it today. And the fact that we saw a brief moment of net neutrality and then repeal of those rules without seeing the harm that critics of repeal suggested were going to happen, and also we've seen a massive expansion in internet speeds, just goes to show how important these mechanisms are.
Central planning has historically had some pretty devastating effects on even the most essential of commodities. With the internet continuing to grow and allowing us to work and innovate in completely new ways, it's hard to imagine life without it. If we can learn anything from the era of net neutrality, it's that freedom and the ability to make our own choices as individuals is integral for progress and innovation.